Hey guys, how's it going? So, welcome to another video of this channel, which I decided to call War on BPD, or Borderline Personality Disorder. And the name is suggesting quite of an aggressive approach to this condition or psychiatric, well, I don't know if you want to call it a disease, but yeah, I guess in medical terms you could call it a disease, a clinical condition, a chronic condition. It all applies on borderline. Now forgive me that I'm using Microsoft Paint to explain, but I found out that Microsoft Paint is really nice if you want to start, talking about a long subject, and if you're the kind of guy who can convey ideas using scribbles and drafts. But nevertheless, I realized I didn't have the chance to introduce myself, so I would like to keep my name anonymous. And the reason for that is because I don't want people to recognize or find out that I have the condition. But at the same time, I feel like I have the amount of knowledge or information about this condition in which I could really help other people. And two reasons for that is because, number one, I graduated med school, so I got that. And number two is because I do have BPD myself. And I'm not implying that I'm somehow privileged in comparison to other people who have borderline, but having an MD allows you to realize aspects and analyze the situation from a perspective that you might not be able to do if you don't have the expert clinical knowledge or the understanding of how certain pathways work. This helped me a lot into realizing that I have the condition, and it also helped me a lot in realizing when the symptoms hit in and when they start to show. And I think these two pieces of information are important for introducing myself without having to mention my name. Maybe in the future, if the channel goes successful and lots of people benefit from it, I wouldn't mind giving off my name, but for the start, let's keep it as it is. What I want to talk about today is the reasons why BPD happens. And understanding why it happens can shed a lot of light on certain situations and can solve certain aspects that face people who have borderline and their relatives. So there are various stated reasons as to what could cause borderline, and there are lots of hypotheses or hypothesis regarding what would cause borderline, and none of these hypotheses are actually confirmed or scientifically exactly confirmed on a scientific biological basis. It's all mostly assumptive work, and it requires further research into what exactly causes it. But the reasons actually make sense, and the reasons are quite accurate. So one of the reasons that people say is childhood. It's always bad to write in paint. Childhood trauma. Yeah, I think this is much better. So one of the reasons is childhood trauma. Another reason that some experts claim to be the causes of borderline is, for example, separation and abandonment. Just like that. And a third reason that I think is the most accurate of all these reasons is chronic stress during childhood. And this is actually the most accurate way of describing or explaining why borderline happens. What they mean with chronic stress is that a child when a child grows up, if this child is exposed to any kind of chronic stress or situation that causes this child to feel stress, whether it's abandonment, trauma, abuse, any kind of situation, no matter how big, no matter how small, no matter how irrelevant that situation seems for your eyes, if it's enough to raise the stress levels of that child long enough for this child to be secreting stress hormones over a long period of time, that would result in damaging a brain organ called the amygdala, which has a huge role in emotion regulation. That would cause the occurrence of borderline. Now, the amygdala is a part in the brain that is responsible for the regulation of emotions. Now, the amygdala can be damaged by stress, by chronic secretion of stress hormones, especially in the early phases of childhood and early adolescence. Their brains are still growing, so the whole nervous system is sensitive to any changes. And the changes of chronic stress hormones are not good. Now, this theory is also challenged because, you have children who grow up in stressful situations like in poverty or in war times, but they don't develop borderline. You see, so it's one kind of stress that is usually related to psychological stress. So see here, sometimes you have children who have non-psychological stress, and sometimes you have psychological stress, and the difference between the two kinds of stress. So let me explain this here to make it clear and to analyze the difference clearly. Non-psychological, and then here we have psychological. And the difference between the two is that this kind of stress is more desperate than this kind of stress. Now, in the non-psychological stress, like for example in poverty, if the child grows up in really harsh conditions, the child has the calmness of mind, knowing that once there is food on the table, the child is going to feel good. So there is an exit. The exit to this exists. Once there's food on the table, once dad comes home with more food, or once there's cash, there is an exit to all the suffering. So the child knows that. Here in the psychological stress, there's no exit. And that is the big difference. That is what makes the stress chronic in this part. And that is what makes it so terrible compared to non-psychological stress. Now, can non-psychological stress lead to that? Yeah, it can lead to that. But this explains why children who go through non-psychological stress don't develop borderline. That's one theory on how, not theory, but that's one explanation that could explain this. So I'll give you an example of psychological stress and what I mean with there's no exit. So for example, if I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you two examples. All right? Sorry about the scribbles. It looks a bit messy, but I think if you follow the thought process, it would make sense. So if you have a 5-year-old kid, and here you have a 10-year-old kid, and you have a snake. There's a snake in the room, right? And you're trapped in a room, okay? So imagine you're a 5-year-old kid, and you're trapped in a room, and there's a snake in front of you. Now there's a window in the background. In your back, there's one window. In front of you is the snake, and behind the snake is the door. So it would look like this. Here's the door. Here's the snake. Here's the child, the 5-year-old, and here's the window. Now, The 5-year-old child might not be able to process the idea of running back and jumping out of the window. Maybe because the child has never tried that out before, maybe because the child knows it's too short and it's going to hurt itself while falling down. Maybe the child is just not mature enough to come to this idea. So right now in this situation, there's no exit for the child. The door is blocked. The child is not able to process that there's an exit through the window. So this is a highly stressful situation because there's no exit in sight. It's chronic, it's desperate, and it's extremely frustrating for the child. Now, a 10-year-old child in this situation is not going to go through this amount of stress. Now, it doesn't matter if it's 5 or 10 years. What I'm trying to say is the more mature child is going to be able to analyze that in this situation, it can jump out of the window. So the situation is not going to be as stressful as for the 5-year-old child that is not able to comprehend this. See? Now imagine this example goes on household violence. Domestic violence. Let's call it DV. Now, the 5-year-old child might think that there is no more escape from this domestic violence forever. This is the destiny. The constant situation of chronic violence is so bad. Or, for example, divorce. If this 5-year-old witnesses divorce of parents, the 5-year-old thinks this is the end of the world. It is not able to comprehend that the world goes on. This kid is not able to comprehend that it may have a better life if there is a divorce. It can live with the mother or the dad and make new friends and make a new life. No, it's not able to comprehend that because it's just not mature enough to have that kind of imagination of the outcome. So the stress level is going to be extremely high. Now, I can get you another child of the same age, but it would not perceive the situation as highly stressful. Why? Because that child might have had the exposure or the chance to live with its grandparents and actually enjoyed living with the grandparents much more than it enjoyed living with the parents. So in this situation, the violence or the divorce or the stimulus of stress is not going to be in a desperate situation like in the snake in the room example, because the child is now able to comprehend that, hey, if that happens, I'm probably going to go back to my grandparents, I'm going to live with them, and that's actually not so bad. So the chronic stress situation, the psychological stress is not high. And that is why, some people start to blame people with borderline. So people with borderline say, hi, I went through some hardships during my adolescence or my childhood. And then they meet someone else who had something worse during their childhood, and that person says, hey, I had it worse than you did. I didn't develop borderline, so you don't have any excuse. Well, no, that's not how it works. It works depending on how it influences your psychological stress. So if the child goes through this phase of the snake in the room example and not being able to comprehend that there's an exit, it's going to lead to high psychological stress. Now, if a child is able to bypass the snake in the room situation by being mature enough to know that there's an outcome, it's not going to have this highly elevated psychological stress. So it doesn't matter what kind of stress it is. It doesn't matter how big or small it is compared to other people. It matters if you go and bypass the situation of the snake in the room example. That's what it comes up to. Now, if you're unfortunate enough that the childhood stress that you go through happens to fall into this category and you qualify for this high psychological stress, then this pathway happens. So it doesn't matter if it's abandonment, if it's separation, if it's divorce, if it's trauma, if it's some kind of domestic violence. It all comes down to this year and how this processes into this year. Yeah, I know it sounds a bit complicated. It sounds a bit far-stretched, but what I want you to understand is you don't have to feel guilt for the fact that you had not such a severe situation, that you were not in poverty or some kind of war times like children in Africa or Syria, I don't know where. It matters if you had the child in the snake desperate situation. That's what matters. So don't feel the guilt. Now, what happens when you have these stress hormones elevated in the sensitive period of neurodevelopment during your childhood and adolescence? The amygdala gets abrased or damaged by these stress hormones. So it reduces in size. So what your body tells the amygdala, okay, I don't know how to draw a body here, okay. Your body tells the amygdala to, hey, you're losing your substance, you're getting damaged by these stress hormones. I have to raise your activity to preserve whatever cells are remaining in this organ. So I'm going to hyperstimulate you so I can preserve what is left of you. And this is a common response in the body. If you don't know human physiology, this happens in human physiology. If the body senses that it's losing a part or losing a certain function, it starts to overstimulate that organ in order to preserve the action of that organ. And this is what happens here. It's a physiological concept. In this situation, this physiological concept causes a condition, which is not good. So what happens when the amygdala is hyperstimulated? Now I'm going to try to find a better way how to draw this. Let me try to erase. Okay, solid fill. Let me try to erase this here. I know it's important, but this is going to furtherly explain what happens. So the amygdala is responsible for emotion regulation. So the emotion happens here. Stimulus leads to perception or observation, like that. So you perceive the stimulus in your body, and that leads to the development of an emotion. Now that emotion is developed and processed through the amygdala. So this emotion, the reason for the emotion, which is this here, which is the perception, goes and gets processed in your brain, and the process of forming an emotion goes through the amygdala. The final output of the amygdala, which is the final emotion that's going to represent itself on judgment, on how you behave, is going to be elevated. So no matter what kind of emotion you feel, it's always going to be hyperstimulated. Whether it's sadness, whether it's rage, whether it's sometimes happiness, excitement, these kind of emotions get hyperstimulated in the process of emotion formation. And when they finally come out of the amygdala, these emotions are hyperstimulated, and they emphasize themselves on your behaviors. So if you're overly excited, you're going to be doing some risky behaviors because you're overly excited. If you're so sad, you're going to be really sad. If you're angry, you're going to be overly angry. And it takes a while for this emotion to go down. So normal people, you see this in children. You have a child who has BPD, right? And you have a child who does not have BPD. So if both of these children are angry, you give a gift to this child and you give a gift to this child to make the anger go away. The anger does not go away in the borderline child, even if you're trying to make up for the mistake or trying to make something better for this kid, the anger remains. Now this kid, once you give it a present or a lollipop or anything or a treat and try to make the world a better place, if to remove the rage, the child calms down and is happy. This child does not go happy. Why? Because it takes a while. It takes much longer for this here to go down, to regulate itself back to normality. It takes time for the amygdala to slow down on its overproduction of this emotion that is exaggerated. And that's why it takes longer for a person who has borderline to come back to normal. if he's going through an emotional state. Now, it's important to realize here that the perception and the emotion are justified. So if you feel sadness in borderline, it is usually because the cause of sadness is actually a cause of sadness. It's justified. The stimulus is a reason for being sad. It's a reason for being angry. It's a reason for being happy. The reasons are legit. It's only the response that comes out of here that is overly exaggerated. That's the problem. The problem is not here. The problem is not in how you perceive the world and what is right and wrong. You're fine in this situation. You don't have a problem. If you get angry at someone because they did something bad, it's because that person actually did something bad. It's just about how you respond to this and the emotional output that you have in response to the stimulus. So some therapists try to change the way how you perceive the world. They say, hey, you don't have to see other people as bad if they do mistakes. Well, no, they did a mistake and that's bad. That is justified. But the emotion that comes out of you is overstimulated, and that's the problem. So don't try to fix something that is already fixed. Don't try to fix your perception. Your perception is fine. Try to fix this, the over-exaggeration of hormones. And in the next videos, I'm going to tell you more about what kind of clinical presentation this has, how the symptoms present, and how these symptoms are really dramatic on a person who has borderline. And I'm going to also tell you how to be able to combat this kind of over-regulation of emotions and how to solve it potentially. So thank you guys for listening to the video, and it was a long and scribbly video, but I hope it conveyed a message and it explained to you what happens in borderline. And if this is the first time you hear about this kind of explanation, or you're not really familiar with this explanation and you found it beneficial, please do say so in the comments so I can have the sort of feedback that is necessary for me to keep on going with this channel. Alright guys, thanks a lot.